horror, you have your classics: monsters, serial killers, ghosts, and zombies. Probably one of the most popular and done-to-death horror films, zombies or infection films are a staple of the horror genre. And recently, for the Halloween season, I wanted to give an analysis to a film that piqued my interest back in high school. We all know how zombie movies go. There's a virus that goes around, spreads to the populace, and a ragtag team of protagonists attempts to survive in this new apocalypse. That's how they generally go, and the way the disease is transmitted is through being bitten. Nothing new there. Likewise, there really isn't any innovation happening in this genre. Zombie movies are like the Call of Duty franchise, good or reliable when you're craving that specific cheap B-movie fix. But if there were any new innovations, a new spin on the formula, what would that look like? Pontypool is a weird movie with probably some of the weirdest and confusing premise on how the virus in this world spreads. I had to watch the whole movie again just to piece together the ins and outs of the virus and the way it's transmitted. Now, I'll be going over the entirety of the movie, and as we go along, I'll give my 2 cents on the plot and try to explain how this virus works as it comes up. But to give you a quick synopsis, a radio host heads into seemingly another boring day at work. But that soon changes as reports of people acting strange and violent start to manifest over the airwaves. And it's later realized the virus's form of transmission is the English language itself. So let's get started. The opening of Pontypool starts off with our radio host Grant Mazzy giving us the latest scoop in the small Canadian town of Pontypool. A cat is missing in town but was later spotted on the bridge, Pont de Flac, after a lady Miss Colette Passine crashed into it to avoid hitting the cat. Grant then begins to point out vague similarities based on the information of the incident, breaking down names into their French translations and names that sound similar to French words, that ultimately result in Miss Colette Culotte Passine, Pontypool, Pont de Flac, Flac being pool, Pontypool, and this all takes place in Pontypool. After hearing this, you might start to smell a sort of conspiracy brewing. This has to mean something, right? Well, Grant explains to us that the American novelist Norman Mailer had a theory detailing how before and after big events, certain pieces of irrelevant data and information will sort of suddenly fit together, and that people will use this to say something big is going to happen. A kind of paranoia and superstition, like if you were to start noticing the letter W always next to a 7 p.m. in license plates. You could say that would be an omen that something terrible is going to happen in the West at 7 p.m. And if this were to spread among the minds of people, for example, a small town, well, maybe with people all just collectively thinking about it, could manifest it into reality. Getting back on track, Grant is then seen coming to a stop in his car, and after reaching for his phone, a woman appears at his passenger window. She seems distressed and Grant can't hear her, and rolling down his window, she walks off into the darkness repeating his words. A strange and thought-provoking introduction to this world. I'd say Pontypool really starts off strong and later in the movie allows you to look back on this scene and pick out the foreshadowing that was planted rather nicely. Moving along, Grant arrives at the radio station, which is the basement of a church. This is where we're introduced to our next set of protagonists, Laurel Ann Drummond, radio technician, and producer Sydney Breyer. And after getting comfortable, Grant starts the broadcast for this morning. It's during this first broadcast that Grant recalls his earlier incident and gives the daily reports of weather and ongoings in the town. Apparently the snowstorm they're in will last all day and another character is revealed, Ken Loney, the on-scene weather reporter in his sunshine chopper.
It's always brighter above the clouds, Grant.
Hey, Ken, how you doing? How are things in that bird up there? You gonna stay in that bird up there during the storm?
Yes, sir.
What sets Ken apart from the other characters is that we never see him. We only ever hear his voice whenever he's reporting on the town. A town we never get to fully see because this basement is the main setting we will be spending all of our time in for the rest of the movie. So Ken is the plot device that is used to progress the story in the beginning. Other minor characters will also call in to help, but for the most part, Ken is our main plot device. The first broadcast of the morning ends after Grant starts to take things down a more controversial path. After a report of a marijuana bust, Grant goes on a tangent about how weed pot growers could be a potential threat to the peaceful neighborhoods of Pontypool, and they might be armed and dangerous. He gets cut off by Sydney before he can do some real damage and reminds him that his job is to report on news, weather, sports, and local spots. Grant and Sydney butt heads because Grant wants to bring in more listeners his way by riling them up and getting them mad, but Sydney doesn't want to hear it. Things settle down and Grant goes live again. He starts talking about his morning incident in depth, and during this, Laurel Ann gets a call from someone but ultimately hangs up because she can't understand whoever is talking to her. Sydney then reveals to us that it's Valentine's Day, and Grant has given both of them Valentine cards. And as she's reading Sydney's card, Laurel Ann gets an incoming police report on the radio, which she almost immediately transfers to Grant. That wasn't Sydney's plan, as she wanted to confirm the report was legit, but Grant is well away with it.
We interrupt our call-in segment to bring you breaking news out of our area this morning.
There's an apparent hostage situation on the ice, but to their dismay, it turns out to be anything but a hostage situation. The two people the police presume to be armed actually never had any guns in the first place. It's at this point that Grant begins taking the piss out of the local police, jokingly saying they're drunk. Ken Loney then takes over, and Sydney takes this opportunity to clue Grant in on how his behavior could end up making the police officers lose their jobs. Not only that, but she reveals to him that Ken is not actually in a helicopter, but actually in his car playing sound effects on top of a hill overlooking the town. It's here where I'd like to note that Grant probably has dreams of being bigger in terms of radio success and notoriety, because Sydney has to constantly remind him of what his job actually entails and ground him back to reality. A quarter of the way into the movie, we finally get our first clue that something might be wrong, as the constable of the police wants Sydney to drop the hostage story entirely, because something happened on the ice. And if that wasn't enough to convince you that something is wrong, Sydney then gets a personal call from Ken, and due to her responses, we can deduce that Ken might be in a panicked state. This sudden call turns out to be breaking news. I'd like to take a second to remark on how well Ken is used throughout the movie. After this point, whenever he makes an appearance, the scenes he describes are very imaginative in the best sense. He will describe what he's currently reporting on, and the words he uses help guide the audience to paint horrific and surreal scenes. It's very straightforward and rather boring to say a group of people toppled over the side of a doctor's office, but it's another to say
Literally hundreds of people packed in and around this building,
resulting in an explosion of people from the now burst open side. This kind of storytelling can make or break a movie's sense of atmosphere, for provide too little information, then your audience is left confused, yet provide too much, then your audience won't want to learn more about the world you're attempting to bring to life. Ken is able to give just enough information to leave the audience wanting to know what is going to unfold next. Much like reading a book with just words, your brain creates the most imaginative exaggeration of scenes since there is no basis to go off from, like say an illustration. Ken also adds that the military has entered the chaos at the office building, right before his signal is lost. To simmer down from those events, now enter Lawrence of Arabia. Now I'm not going to try to seem like I know anything about or the significance of Lawrence of Arabia in this movie, but I do have to say this segment kind of brings me out of it. If you were paying attention earlier in the film, Sydney walks with Laurel Ann and mentions off to the side that Lawrence of Arabia performers would show up later for an interview.
Anyways, we got the Lawrence of Arabia cast coming in, so we're going to brighten up the day with that.
But they're only used to further the plot, as we'll see. However, what brings me out of it is the blatant brown face. All seriousness that was built from Ken's report is thrown out the window here. I think this could have been handled better. Maybe don't depict brownface, it adds nothing and just ends up being a blemish to the story. Are we supposed to take this in a comedic sense? That we're supposed to laugh at the absurdity of this concept? I assume Grant is a reflection of the audience's reaction, and his manager on the phone is whoever pushed for this scene to be included in the final cut. Because Grant pretty much feels the same as I did when I had to sit through the scene.
Fuck you, Rick.
After a rather short performance, which I'm glad that didn't have to spend too much time with these people, one of the performers starts babbling about how she can't remember how the song ends. She then becomes more distressed and begins repeating the same word. They then leave the station and Sydney is able to wrangle an eyewitness that might provide more info explaining the events of Ken's report. Yet all we hear over the call is screaming and heavy static interference.
Steve Van Denzen. Okay, I'm afraid we've lost the signal from Steve.
Grant reports that there's a mob moving towards the office of Dr. John Mendez. In addition, people are babbling, not making sense. To drop even more info into the pot, Constable Rosalind moves the story along by reporting presumably the same mob from earlier trying to enter the home of an elderly woman who has died, due to the mob forcefully cramming themselves into her room, all the while chanting, most likely crushing her to death. As well as a family member has been trapped in their van due to a mountain of people covering them from all sides, to the point that the police have not been able to see the van in hours. To make matters worse, the BBC have caught news of what's been happening and wants to interview Grant. Nigel Healing of the BBC throughout this back and forth seemingly belittles Grant after Grant admits that he does not know what exactly is happening in his own town. And Nigel in turn chalks it up to terrorist activity. The info dump is not done yet because our dear Ken is back to fill us in what has gone down since we've last heard of him. Ken has taken refuge in a grain silo.
Reporter Ken Loney. Ken, are you there, Ken?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Send someone. I'm not safe here. I've seen things today that are gonna ruin the rest of my natural life, Grant. And I'm scared. I'm scared.
And as a true reporter, he looks out from a doggy door to the silo to see a group of these people pulling two others out from a van.
Hey, Ken, who are they?
There's a bunch of them. They're people, but they're crazy. They're pulling these two out of the van. Oh my God! They're fighting them. They're actually carrying them to the ground in their mouths. I can't see them.
The same van that was housing the family under the mountain of bodies. Ken details the crazed people as a feeding frenzy of piranha, tearing the family apart limb from limb. I have to add the voice actor that voices Ken does a stellar job selling his descent from happy-go-lucky weather reporter to an individual that has witnessed ungodly and heinous acts, but is still sane enough to recognize that he has to report on these horrific scenes to warn others. Unfortunately, one of the crazed people has heard Ken from the silo and begins bolting towards him, crashing through the wall. It turns out to be a teenage boy, and Ken approaches him as the boy is saying something with his last few breaths. As he inches closer, we hear...
He's whispering something. He's saying something. I'm gonna get closer and see if I can just hear what he's saying.
No, I wouldn't do that, Ken.
But before we are able to hear anything, we're cut off by a weird radio transmission that has hijacked the basement's broadcast and is reciting something in French. Once the monologue is over and translated, Grant recites that the voice was saying to avoid family members, terms of endearment, baby talk, and lastly, to avoid the English language and not translate the message. In their need to fully disclose everything to the public, Grant and co. have probably just doomed the entire town of Pontypool. This hits harder when you understand that Grant as a character just wants to be real and upfront with his listeners, and generally cares to provide the people the truth. However, in this case, he might have just caused them more harm than good. And now they've gotten word that they're under quarantine. Miraculously, Ken is able to reconnect with our group and proceeds to have us listen to the teenager's breathing as he lies on the ground. And as we hear the boy's labored breathing, we can make out what seems to be the sound of a baby's voice calling out to their mother. Grant speaks for the audience when he asks if this is really happening, because of course, the same as Grant, we too have been cooped up here in this basement, listening to these apocalyptic scenes and stories. You can only imagine what kind of cabin fever could be brewing in Grant, since we only ever seen him in a small sound booth within an already claustrophobic church basement. The cabin fever may have already set in because Grant begins to hallucinate voices. Sydney thinks Grant is not taking this seriously, which causes Grant to lose it for a second. He reels back and now just wants to go outside to confirm if this whole situation is real. The girls try to stop him, but he's not taking no for an answer. I think the choice to let the audience see the outside, even for just a brief moment, is a good way to appease the people that are itching to see this antagonist of the movie. Just as it seems there's nothing outside, Laurel Ann shuts the door as the mob of crazed people have arrived at the church. And like the one from the beginning, the mob is repeating what Sydney and Grant just said.
We have an enemy, sir.
Laurel Ann, we got an enemy.
A little side note, I find it funny that Sydney screams at Grant to come back like he's walking into the snowstorm, but is literally inches away. Also, she slaps her hand on the door, and in the next scene, it shows that she was able to hurt herself to the point that she drew blood. I don't know what kind of strength this woman has, but this injury is never brought up or becomes a hindrance for the rest of the movie. Halfway into the film, the threat has made its appearance. The mob presumably has the whole building surrounded, and if they were able to crash into an office building, the team has limited time before the mob makes their way inside. A little more of the outside is revealed to us as we get a montage of the victims' obituaries that perished due to this tragedy. We then get a shot of Laura Ann tending to Sydney's wounds. They talk about the obituaries Grant is reading and how they can't believe so many people died. Sydney then asks Laura Ann if anything like this ever happened while she was in Afghanistan. But Laura Ann responds with something off-putting.
No, sir. I believe the situation I brought back in my head.
Shortly after hearing this, you'd ask yourself what she meant by this, to which Sydney does, which just exposes something even worse.
I don't really know. I'm gonna go see if Mr. Massey's missing. 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 I mean, Mr. Massey.
Laurel Ann begins speaking incoherently, saying Grant is missing, but we know he's not. He's in the sound booth, almost as if she's undergoing symptoms of a stroke. She then excuses herself, and Sydney promptly goes to take the whistling teapot off the stove. I like this little effect with the teapots whistling down as Laurel Ann's mimicking of the whistling rises at the same time to have us thinking, why are we still hearing the whistling? While this is happening, someone barges in through a window. Dr. John Mendez, the same doctor whose office was overrun by the mob. He urges Sydney into the sound booth where for now our characters will be hunkering down in, because as it turns out, Laurel Ann has succumbed to the virus. Now let's quickly talk about Dr. Mendez. He serves the role of explaining the virus to the audience, and I personally don't feel too strongly about him. His whole demeanor doesn't sit right with the rest of the cast. While I understand he knows more about this virus than the rest, he doesn't display any sort of panic or urgency to the epidemic. And when he explains the early symptoms Laura Ann is going through, he treats it as a show, almost as if there's no stakes or real peril here. It turns out when infected, you lose the ability to form coherent sentences and understand proper syntax. From there, the person will repeat a specific word and begin hunting for other people to infect. Just as Grant breaks the news to his listeners that Laura Ann has gone to the virus, Ken is back to give us an update. He reports he's still inside the grain silo from before and can hear people every so often pass by chanting, "Look out for U-boats." Just like that, a grave mistake is made.
Well, they weren't talking really. They were just sort of chanting something about, look out for U-boats. Look out for U-boats. Look out for U-boats.
Were they all saying this, Ken?
Yeah, all of them. It's a symbol of the disorder.
A symbol of the disorder? You mean a symptom?
It's a symbol. I have a problem.
Ken begins spiraling into random phrases before becoming,
Can you think?
I can't. Yeah.
Let's stick to simple questions. Simple.
Simple question. Simple.
That's it. He's gone. This is what he is now. He's just a crude radio signal. He's seeking.
At this point, we have lost a real trooper, the unsung hero. Sydney then breaks down and doesn't take Ken's loss all too well. She laments the loss of a friend, but then calls him
Wasn't a friend. Ken Loney was a pedophile. I mean, not really a pedophile. We just never let our kids go.
If you're watching this for the first time, I can understand if you're confused as I initially was. However, if we take what we know so far about the virus, the early symptoms are misplacing words. So instead of taking this sentence as bad writing, it seems Sydney is displaying symptoms of the virus. This is brushed off, however, because Laurel Ann is back and seems to have been eating something. Finally, this is where Mendez deduces that the virus is spreading through infected words, specific words. Now this is what piqued my interest, the new take on the zombie formula. Dr. Mendez explains the virus came from a perception, as if people willed it into existence, playing with the idea that words can be infected until they did. Now this virus, just from a collective idea, is all too real now. A word will be infected, and once a person says the word or phrase will become infected, but also has the ability to infect other words they repeat from healthy individuals. As we saw with Ken, he unexpectedly infected himself by repeating the phrase, "Look out for U-boats," from the people that pass by. Yet, just saying the word or phrase is not what transmits the virus. It's when you process what the word means in your brain does the virus take hold. Say the word dog is infected. You hear the word and understand what that means. Your brain processes the word and reaches into its filing cabinet holding the definition and idea of what a dog is. Now you're infected and will slowly lose your grasp on coherent thought and result to hunting other healthy victims to further spread the virus. Tragically, Grant is now in a dilemma. He can warn the remaining listeners how the virus spreads and risk inadvertently infecting them, or don't tell them, causing them to succumb to the horrors of the virus. They ultimately decide to not speak and risk it. What I don't understand is that if they truly didn't want to talk and risk infecting others, then why are they still alive? Dr. Mendez even jokes about Grant's breathing being heard. This is why I think Mendez wasn't written well, because we get a shot of the horde outside beginning to break into the building and he's cracking jokes, clearly contrasting the severity of the situation, and it appears Mendez has been infected, presumably from the U-boats phrase. Also, apparently everyone likes to break rules and doesn't care about survival because Sydney gets a call from her kids and she begins saying the words of endearment and baby talk, words that are at high risk of infection. While this call continues, Laurel Ann is seen becoming more violent and even destroys some equipment. She then comes back and she vomits blood and decides to exit game. Mendes then explains how this is what happens to infected who can't find anyone else to infect after a prolonged state. So the virus is actively causing the victim to die unless they find another individual to help spread the virus. After her death, the horde then makes their way to the sound booth. Running out of time, the group begins brainstorming ideas on how to lure the horde away, and end up using the outside speakers to play a looping recording of Grant saying, I assume they went with this as a way for possible rescue teams to know that there are still survivors, and it looks like it worked as we see the horde walking away outside. But the celebration is cut short as now Grant and Sydney have another problem to address. Mendes is unsurprisingly infected. Weirdly, however, Mendes in his babbling state sounds like he's switching languages before blurting out that only the English language is infected. Still not fully trusting that he's safe, Grant and Sydney walk out and start only speaking in French. Making their way up the stairs, Sydney is attacked by one of the performer girls from earlier, and in one of the most surreal scenes I've ever witnessed, Grant pulls the girl off of Sydney and suddenly wiped off screen along with a jarring sound effect that plays. As the sound effect swells and zips back to reality, we're shown that the two are stomping out the little girl. I mean, what? Then the two argue over who actually killed her, but I mean, it seemed like a team effort. When I first rewatched this scene, I honestly thought my video player was messed up or the digital film was corrupted, but no, this scene plays out this way. Regardless, the two then argue who should kill the doctor, since he could be a problem for them later. But before they can do anything, the military hijacks the station again and starts playing music inside, and the horde is back. They run inside the storage room for safety and hold the door open long enough for the doctor to briskly jog inside. At this point, is the horde just not that serious that a light jog is enough to outpace them? I get that Mendes pretty much knows the cure, or at least a way to prevent the infection from fully taking hold, seeing as he can just escape from a window to lure the horde away, but the movie really just loses steam by the end here. Now just each other for company, Grant starts listening to records from earlier in the day to maybe figure out a cure for the virus, while Sydney has given up hope and begins drinking. Unceremoniously, she too is becoming infected, repeating the infected word kill. In a last-ditch effort, Grant attempts to disinfect the word kill by making it incomprehensible, or changing the meaning of kill. Since the virus takes hold after understanding the word, changing the word's previous meaning to a new one that doesn't make sense is the way a word can be cleansed and prevent the virus from manifesting in the person. Kill is now kiss, and the two share a kiss on top of it. Afterwards, Grant and Sydney take to the sound booth to spread the word on how to stop the virus. Now it's a race against the clock as the military have begun their plan to devastate the town, killing infected people. Grant starts rattling off words and changing their meanings at random, because it can't just be the opposite of the word like happy to sad, because that in of itself is comprehensible. Grant then gets fed up with the military yelling for them to stop, and as he makes his last broadcast, a countdown is begun and the two share their last kiss. End scene. After all that, was the movie good? Well, let me first start off that I love the use of Ken as our eyes to explore and reveal the outside world to us. The kind of imagery and horrific scenes that can be conjured up by the mind can rival anything that is blatantly depicted. Only you know how to truly scare yourself, and the movie knows this. So restricting our access to the outside and making us use our imagination to see what Ken sees sets the mood for the rest of the movie. Up until Ken dies. Yeah, I think the movie knew they couldn't just rely on Ken for scares and had to infect someone inside to actually pose a threat. However, Ken as the plot device helps to keep the movie engaging because after Ken reports the first signs of trouble, you're invested to see what happens next. Which leads me to my next point. The movie kinda dips in quality and tension after Ken dies, and the introduction of the virus encyclopedia that is Dr. Mendes does not help the movie. He was very awkwardly handled, and I just don't get any sort of real danger after he's on screen. The light jog he does is just comedic to say the least. Another thing the movie does well is the way it handles foreshadowing. There are multiple examples like the Valentine cards in the beginning, and since Laurel Ann is the only one seen to read a card, you can infer that was when she got infected, and throughout gets progressively exposed to more infected words from the multiple callers speaking in tongues from the virus. Also Sydney referencing the Lawrence of Arabia performers, which again, the performers could have been cut and had anything else put in its place, because other than being a callback later with the child attacking Sydney, the brown face does nothing good for the movie. I have to reiterate again, there might be an underlining meaning with the Lawrence of Arabia story, so they might have some significance to be included in the movie, but I don't feel like I'm the one to go into that, so I won't try. Overall, I really like the new take on the zombie formula, with language being the thing that transmits the disease. And it's almost scary to think that if this was real, the world probably wouldn't stand a chance, seeing as we have the internet and all, and social media, which would be interesting to see how that would work, as you just need to process infected words, so I'd assume the spread would be astronomically fast. I'd like to point out that actually MGS5 would have something similar to this virus in the form of the vocal cord parasite. I thought I'd throw that in because I actually wasn't privy to this until I watched Gingy's video on the MGS series. Lastly, is the movie good? I'd say the movie does some things right and others not so, and others even worse. However, I'd still recommend this movie as it holds a very interesting spin on your typical infection film, which I think is enough seeing how there's not really others like it. If you're wanting other horror related videos on my channel, I have 2 others you might enjoy. Yet seeing as I plan to get this video out on Halloween, you might already be preparing for Christmas, so happy Halloween, and I hope to see you in my next hyperfixation.